Have you ever played against a deck that just won't die? No matter what you remove, counter, or destroy, another threat immediately takes its place. That's the power of an all-gas, no-breaks deck. Relentless, redundant, and completely unstoppable. When every card has backups, every threat replaces itself, and every play keeps the pressure on, your opponents will feel like they're trying to stop a runaway train with a stop sign. Let's break down how you can build a deck that just won't quit. Everyone has probably heard of Arch Enemy. Sometimes a player sits down with a deck that is just really hard to stop. Oftentimes you might see Group Slug decks be this, you might see Eldrazi decks be this, or Sliver decks be this way. But why is that? Today we're not only going to answer the question of why these decks are so powerful, but we're going to talk about how you can build one yourself. Now, does this mean that I'm going to advocate for you to build an Eldrazi deck? Not necessarily. Am I going to advocate for Sliver decks or Group Slug decks? Again, not necessarily, but there are reasons why these decks are so good, and I'm sure you can tell why, but we're going to go over it in this video. So while we do that, I will explain why I believe these decks are the way they are, and why pretty much no matter what you find of these decks, they're going to be the same way, and they're all going to be powerful. The Distraction Makers is a podcast that talks a lot about game design and relates it a lot back to Magic the Gathering. In one of their more recent videos, they talk about CEDH and why they don't like it as a format, mostly because of something they like to call quantitative deck building versus qualitative deck building.
They're sort of like deck building philosophy. You have a deck that is built around quality cards, which are cards that are individually quite powerful, or you have a deck that's built around quantity cards, which means that the individual cards are not necessarily the most that powerful, but in a quantity of them, they are quite strong.
Quantitative deck building is when a type of strategy has a ton of support around it. It's usually seen a lot more in 60 card formats where every card serves a purpose for a single goal. And it's quantitative because every card can essentially achieve this goal by themselves. Now, qualitative is what they had a big problem with, especially when it comes to CEDH.
CEDH exists in a world where only quality cards matter. Part of that has to do with the systems of Commander and how they have facilitated this experience.
Not only is CEDH highly qualitative, but Commander as a whole is a more qualitative format than quantitative format. But that doesn't mean that we're going to stop ourselves from trying to make a quantitative deck. So the first couple things and avenues we can look into is tribal decks. Now, the reason tribal decks often are more quantitative than qualitative is because tribal decks usually have payoffs for themselves. Think about Azorius Soldiers. Think about Vampires or Merfolk. These are more quantitative decks since almost every Merfolk is going to help you with your Merfolk strategy, and almost every Vampire is going to help you with your Vampire strategy. This is why a lot of these cards can be considered more quantitative than qualitative, and is why a lot of these tribal decks, especially Eldrazi and Slivers, are considered these arch enemy type decks because of the amount of support that it is given. Now, another thing that we can talk about is different themes in Commander. In EDHREC, there are plenty of themes that are present in this format. There's artifact decks, treasure decks, token decks, and +1/+1 counter decks. These are some of the most common types of decks and archetypes you can find in Commander. And the reason why is because they have so much support going for them. In order to make a more quantitative deck that can be all gas, no breaks, unfortunately, it has to require a ton of support for that archetype. And not only do you need to have a lot of support for that archetype, but you need to use the highest quality cards in that archetype as well. This doesn't necessarily mean that they're all super expensive, but it certainly can. Now, in order to even further refine our quantitative deck, we need to have some sort of outlet for this theme. It can't just be a treasure deck where you make a bunch of treasures. It needs to also have a powerful payoff for those treasures. Now, this is why you can see that Eldrazi and Slivers are so impactful. Not only do they have a bunch of support for one another, and not only is there a ton of cards available for the strategy, but the cards themselves are extremely powerful and are all hard to deal with. Yes, you might be able to deal with the first 10/10 that they play, but can you deal with the next one? And can you deal with the next one? It's really hard to deal with. And Slivers is the same way in the opposite direction. Instead of going tall, they go wide. And with support, they have even more. Every sliver buffs the rest of your slivers, which means that you can easily have 6 or 7 slivers on the battlefield that all are giving each other effects like +1/+1, first strike, haste, and trample. These decks are quantitative decks to the max. And it's one of the biggest reasons why I think these decks have a huge downside, is because they require a ton of support on top of having really good direction in the commander you use and the strategy you're going for. But we're going to figure out how to do that today. So we've talked about the downsides of quantitative decks in the fact that it almost requires a lot of support in order to actually build it. But the great thing about this is once we actually find a strategy that is able to be quantitative, it's time to go all in on that. The biggest upside of these quantitative decks is the fact that you can go all in on these strategies, adding almost 30 to 36 cards of this particular strategy in your deck. There's no reason for balance when there's so much support already. And not only that, but having so many cards towards the strategy lessens the effect of removal by your opponents. It doesn't matter what answers they have if you're able to replace it every single turn. So if your entire goal is to control the board and drain the table slowly, then you should have 30 plus cards that are able to do this in some form or fashion that can be payoffs for your strategy. Whether that means when you make a token, you deal damage. When a token dies, you deal damage. When you attack, you deal damage, or any other form of area of effect damage. Now, because this strategy has so much support, you can easily find 30 cards that are able to help you do this. In order to give you the best example of this, I want to talk about my Marchesa deck. My Queen Marchesa deck has seen quite a few iterations it's gone through. At one point, it was a Goad deck. At another point, it was a Legends deck. But I think I finally have figured it out. Mardu is great at one thing: dealing damage. This entire deck's goal is to have passive value in order to deal that damage. And in that passive value, most of these cards are meant to deal damage to the entire table. Vran, Executioner Thane, Wisp Drinker Vampire, Rotten Mouth Viper, Perforos God of the Forge are just a few of the area of effect damage I'm looking to deal to my opponents. Then, in order to support this strategy, I have a lot of token support as well. While not nearly as much, there are still some tokens available. Now, in these all gas, no brakes types of decks, you don't need as much card draw because most cards are able to replace themselves while stuck in your hand. I am perfectly fine with somebody removing my Mirkwood Bats because I know I'm going to play a Loyal Subordinate next turn. I'm okay with people removing my Loyal Subordinate because I'm going to play the Meat Hook Massacre the next turn as well. And once again, I'm okay with them removing Meat Hook Massacre because my Twilight Prophet is resting in my hand waiting for something else to happen. The 4 cards I just mentioned are here to deal damage to the entire table. And there are so many more cards in this list that are able to do that. Because a majority of our deck is built for one thing and one thing only in a quantitative approach, we don't need nearly as much card draw as you typically might in another deck that's a lot more qualitative. In qualitative decks, you might only have 15 to 20 cards that are available for the strategy you're looking to pull off. But in a quantitative deck, you're able to have so much support that it's almost hard to whittle down to only 34 or 35 cards. Now, again, the only downside to this is the fact that you need to have and choose a strategy or theme that is able to have this much support. Mardu has a ton of ways of getting this passive value. I can get draw from my opponents doing things. I can deal damage from my opponents doing things, and I can do things myself. This strategy might be a lot harder if you're doing it in colors that don't have as much support like this, or you're trying to pull off a different kind of strategy that doesn't nearly have enough cards printed for something like that to happen. In order to have an all gas, no brakes type of approach, at least in Casual Commander, I think a quantitative approach is the best way to go. Now, although less draw is typically required from something with a lot of support in it, I typically think a strategy like this works best with the commander that can give you that support. The reason Marchesa is the perfect commander of choice for a deck like this is because not only is she able to make tokens herself if needed, but also with the Monarch, we get at least an extra draw every single turn. So we're at least drawing 2 cards instead of 1. Now, we do have some draw support in here as well, but it's not nearly as much as other decks might have. But like I said, that's okay. Almost every single card we draw is going to get us faster and faster into this game plan, so we don't need to worry about drawing so many cards in order to get to the gas we need, which is another reason why it's so hard to stop these kind of decks. and the reason they become the archenemy so often. Who cares about a board wipe when you have the exact same strategy ready to go stuck in your hand? Who cares about spot removal when every threat replaces itself? And who cares about exile when you have 4 or 5 cards that all do the exact same thing? But yet another great thing about quantitative decks is that it also forces your opponents to have removal. Yes, everything replaces itself, but it only replaces itself if they have that removal, which means if they don't, you have multiple of the same effect happening over and over and over again because they don't have any answers. If your opponents don't have it, you can end up winning pretty easily because of the amount of support given. So, quantitative decks are all gas, no brakes kind of decks. Quantitative decks usually require a ton of support for whatever strategy they're brewing, but if that support is there, you can easily put 30 to 36 cards of that exact strategy into the deck. Balance isn't needed in a deck like this when there is so much support there for you already. I think the biggest reason why I try to stay away from quantitative decks is not only because in most cases people don't like playing against it due to its power level, but also because having optimized list in something like Casual Commander is not always the best route to go. Is it fun? Absolutely. Do I like having powerful cards? Absolutely. But do I also just want to sit down and play some funky strategies like my Saheeli Living Energy deck? Also, absolutely. On this channel, I like talking about powerful strategies and I like talking about powerful deck building principles. But as fun as something like this is every once in a while, it's not for everybody and it's not a one size fits all. Today we talked about quantitative deck building in Commander, and so now I hope we all can understand how we can build a strategy like this ourselves. Thank you guys all so much for watching, and I hope to see you guys next time.